Hi Year 11. This video refers to trophic levels and discusses some of the ecological relationships that the living things in a community will have with each other. Now, one of the most simplistic ways of looking at the relationships between the living things in a community are to consider the trophic levels that they sit on. And the trophic levels that they sit on basically are descriptors for their feeding roles. And you can broadly put everything into two distinct groups. One would be at the lowest of the trophic levels, and those would be the producers. Those are organisms that are producing their own food, and they're doing that from the raw materials they'll have in their environment. Your typical example of a producer is going to be your plants carrying out photosynthesis to make their own food. You then have multiple levels of consumers. So you'll have primary consumers that will generally eat producers, and then secondary, tertiary, and maybe even quaternary consumers. These are consumers that are organisms that basically eat other organisms for their food. So they're animals. They'll eat other animals to get their food, and they're getting that food because that food is their energy source. They can, so let's break down some other roles and some terms that are very common when we're talking about ecology. So you've got things like herbivores, and those will be things that are referring to eating plants only. There's lots of different types of herbivores depending on how they're eating plants. So you might have some things that would be pollinators, where they're going to be surviving on nectar that they're getting when they're doing pollinating. You might have some seed dispersers. You might have some grazers, which would be larger animal species that would be feeding on grasses. You might have carnivores, and carnivores are generally going to be animals that are eating other animals. So good examples in the New Zealand bush, an introduced species that's a pest would be something that would be a stoat. Stoats feeding on the brain matter of other animals. They're lovely. Lots of organisms are omnivores, so they're capable of eating plants and animals as food sources. So humans are an example of that, but a common pest species in the New Zealand bush would be a rat species. You'll also have scavengers. So these are organisms that will feed on dead animals. Vultures are an example of that. You have a lot of animals that are opportunistic in their consumption, so they will eat multiple other things. Rat is not above eating dead animals. At the same time, it's not above eating out your bin. At the same time, it's not above eating the seeds of a plant or actually feeding on the egg of another animal, of a bird species. So you can see that sometimes consumers can have multiple roles here. There are also, as I mentioned, scavengers that feed off dead animals, but parasites. And these will feed off living organisms, but will not generally they won't kill that other living organism. So they will cause harm, but a good parasite doesn't kill its host. It can happen and it does happen, but the difference between the parasites and the others on here is they are feeding off that living organism rather than eating a dead one. A good example would be you get many species of insects that are parasites, also many microbes, but the example given to you here is a good one, and it's a flea. Then lastly, you have your decomposers, and your decomposers will be feeding on dead organisms, but they are breaking down those dead organisms. So, and that has a role in terms of nutrient recycling. So let's be specific here as to the difference between a scavenger and a decomposer. Something like a fungus will be breaking down that dead organism and in its wastes that it is producing will be recycling the chemicals and compounds and nutrients that are in that decaying organism. So this is a way that things like nitrogen and carbon are readily cycled back into the environment, usually making things like the constituents of soil, and that will support the growth of other organisms in that habitat. So things like plants will be able to grow in soils that have good supplies of nitrogen for them. Recognize here the different roles, know what they are, be able to apply them. Also recognize when we're talking about a trophic level, the food chain. And the food chain is showing you the flow of the energy from one organism to another organism through the community. Food chains begin with producers. They're connected by arrows from the food to whatever is taking that food, so wherever the energy is going. Do not do equal signs. Equal signs say this is the same as. Arrow means this goes from this towards this. Okay, so please be conscious of drawing your arrow when you are describing your food chain. Recognize as well that you're going to have multiple levels in your food chain. So broadly, you'll go from your producer and then up your trophic levels from your herbivore to your carnivore to your secondary carnivore. And that's shown to you here where your producer is your lettuce, your herbivore is your snail, your primary carnivore is your blackbird, your secondary carnivore is your cat. It's a descriptor for the different things in those food chains. Recognize that it's very rare for a food chain to exist in isolation in a habitat. What you'll very often have are the combination of the food and the feeders in a community. So this will allow you to get an insight into who is competing with whom for specific resources. It will also allow you to see who is an omnivore, who is basically herbivorous and carnivorous, who is doing both of those things. It will not necessarily show you your decomposers, your parasites, or the other roles that living things have in a habitat. So who your pollinators are, who your seed dispersers are. And as such, you need to be looking for, when you're looking at a community, who are your keystone species, the species that's role in that habitat is so critical that if they were to no longer be there, there would be significant repercussions and chaos effectively affecting the wider habitat and the wider community of the organisms around it. If you remove them, you can have that deck of falling cards, because the effects of a massive reduction in their numbers may have significant effects for other species in a particular community. And it is not always as straightforward as, oh, it's the one at the top or the one at the bottom. Okay, it can be related to their role as a pollinator, their role as a seed disperser, if we're talking about a bird species. Okay, upstream changes to food webs. So if we're looking here, you're seeing what the effect is of a change to one organism on the subsequent trophic levels. So if you look here, you'll see that reduction in seaweed is going to mean, well, there's going to be a reduction in the population of crabs and squids. Penguins and elephant seals are going to have a significant issue from there, and that may have a problem for elephant seals and killer whales. We look at the other side of that, it's going to mean that the phytoplankton are going to have less competition in terms of getting light and resources. As a result of that, there's likely to be an increase in the populations of zooplankton and krill as the phytoplankton population increased. This would have upstream effects for the fish, for the seagulls, for the leopard seals, and for the blue whales. The thing to watch out for here is though, given that the leopard seals are no longer going to be able to have as many penguins coming through because there's been a reduction there because of the seaweed, you will end up with potential effects to the leopard seal population, and that may have an impact on other things like seagulls or fish because they are predated by the leopard seal itself. Your takeaway here, complex. Change in one area of a food web can have significant implications in other areas. And please recognize that this in itself does not show the effect of a change to something that has a role that isn't described, something that is a pollinator, something that is a seed disperser. Flip side, downstream effects. So taking something near the top, near the apex of a food web, and its effects further on down. So if we look at that, if we remove killer whales from this, then obviously killer whales as a predator of leopard seals and penguins and elephant seals would result in an increase in the numbers of leopard seals and penguins and elephant seals in the short term. This would have a significant impact on the squid population because they are no longer, their predator is now in a larger amount and was being kept in balance by the killer whales, which in turn is going to have an impact on other species in the habitat. Your big idea here, okay, you decrease the numbers at one level, there are going to be impacts at other levels. And it's important whenever you look at a food web to be mindful of what those effects are.